Ever read an online comment so stupid it made you physically angry? Now imagine that instead of a downvote button, the only response was a duel to the death. For centuries, that was basically reality. The most trivial, idiotic, and brain-dead arguments were regularly settled with swords and pistols. We found 33 of the absolute worst. This isn't a history of honor, it's a catalog of lethal pettiness. 1. Picture the scene. A lavish 18th century French dinner party, empty wine bottles everywhere, and two aristocrats, the Marquis de Saint-Fort and the Count de Rivière, locked in a debate of earth-shattering importance. The topic? The aerodynamic potential of the common frog. One insisted they could achieve flight. The other vehemently disagreed. As the night wore on and the wine flowed, this bizarre scientific inquiry transformed into a deeply personal insult to each other's intelligence. Instead of doing the logical thing, finding a frog and a trebuchet to test the hypothesis, they did the nobleman thing. They drew swords. The duel ended when one was wounded, proving absolutely nothing about flying frogs, but demonstrating conclusively that a gentleman's honor was apparently located somewhere in the same part of the brain that houses terrible ideas. 2. Challenging Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, to a duel was a terrible idea for most mortals. But his political rival, Rudolf Virchow, was a brilliant pathologist, not a foolish swordsman. When called out, Virchow used his right as the challenge party to choose the weapons, and his choice was a stroke of passive-aggressive genius. He presented two pork sausages. He calmly explained that one was perfectly nourishing, while the other was deliberately infected with deadly trichinella larvae, visible only under a microscope. Bismarck, the man of blood and iron, was invited to choose his weapon and consume it. The great Chancellor, who had stared down empires, was now faced with a 50-50 choice between lunch and a gruesome death by parasitic worm. Realizing he was being outsmarted in the most humiliating way possible, he declined the duel, admitting defeat by sausage. 3. Some arguments over a friendly game of billiards can get heated, but for two Frenchmen, Melfont and L'Enfant, it became the last game they'd ever play together. In 1843, a dispute over a rule or a shot escalated with stunning speed. Deciding that honor demanded a duel, they looked around the room and thought, why walk all the way outside when we have perfectly good projectiles right here? They agreed to a duel on the spot, using the heavy, solid billiard balls as their weapons. Taking positions at a distance, they prepared to throw. Melfont, who apparently possessed a pitcher's arm, wound up and hurled the first ball with incredible force. It flew across the room and struck L'Enfant directly in the forehead with a sickening thud, killing him instantly. It was a brutal, absurd, and frankly idiotic end to a life, all over a game no one would remember the score of. 4. You might think that a shared love of food brings people together, but in 18th century Ukraine it could lead to bloodshed. During a grand feast, two nobles, Adam Zholkevsky and Ivan Kvasnevsky, fell into a ferocious argument over the proper way to make borscht. This wasn't a friendly exchange of recipes, it was a deeply personal culinary war. Whose grandmother used the right kind of beet? Was a certain herb an abomination or a necessity? The disagreement became so venomous that it was deemed an unforgivable slur upon their family honor. A challenge was issued, swords were drawn, and a duel was fought over soup. Zholkevsky managed to wound Kvasnevsky, presumably making his borscht recipe the victor by trial of combat. It's a terrifying reminder that for some, my mom's cooking is the best, is not a statement. It's a fighting word. 5. In the 18th century, a man's honor was apparently as fragile as a piece of wet paper. A gentleman named Mr Broxopp found this out when his dog, after a delightful swim in a river, did what every dog in history has done. It shook itself dry. Unfortunately, the spray landed on the dresses of two nearby ladies. Another man, Captain Fleetwood, witnessed this heinous act of canine effrontery, and his mind just snapped. To him, this wasn't an accident. It was a grave insult delivered by a four-legged agent of chaos. He immediately challenged the dog's owner to a duel. the honor of the slightly dampened ladies had to be defended with potentially lethal force. One can only imagine Mr. Broxopp trying to explain to his wife that he might die the next day because his dog got a little too enthusiastic after a swim. 6. Richard Martin was an Irish MP known as Humanity Dick for his pioneering work in animal welfare, even co-founding the RSPCA. His entire public image was built on protecting animals from human cruelty, which makes it all the more ironic that he once challenged a man to a duel for shooting his goat. The goat, to be fair, had been methodically destroying the prized flower garden of his neighbor, Baron George Gort, who finally had enough and dealt with the problem directly. For Martin, however, this wasn't pest control. It was a personal attack on a beloved friend. In a spectacular moment of cognitive dissonance, the man dedicated to preventing cruelty decided the only appropriate response to the death of an animal was to attempt to kill a human. His love for animals was so strong, it made him want to commit homicide. 7. The ballroom is a place for elegance, romance, and, for one French admiral, simmering, inexplicable rage. At a high society ball, Admiral de Lassus grew increasingly furious with a large German gentleman on the dance floor. The offense wasn't a stepped-on toe or a clumsy turn. The Admiral's official complaint was that the man was waltzing against him. The historical record provides no further explanation for what this bizarre accusation even means. Was his technique somehow menacing? Was he spinning with malicious intent? Whatever the perceived slight, the Admiral felt his honor had been so grievously wounded by this aggressive waltzing that he challenged the German to a duel. It's a terrifying thought that your dance moves, no matter how innocent, could be interpreted as a capital offense by a man with a very thin skin and a pair of pistols. 8. In 19th century France, you had to watch what you said about a man's accessories. Colonel Barbier Dufay took mortal offense to the cockade, the decorative ribbon, on the hat of Captain Raoul de Vere. These ribbons were potent political symbols, so insulting one was like spitting on a flag. The duel that followed was uniquely nightmarish. They decided against a conventional fight and instead agreed to be locked inside a moving carriage with daggers, with orders for the driver to circle continuously until one of them was dead. It was a rolling death match, a chaotic, bloody brawl in a dark, confined space. The sheer brutality of fighting with knives while being thrown about in a carriage is horrifying to imagine, and it all started because one man made a snide remark about another man's hat decoration. 9. When a typical love triangle just isn't dramatic enough, you take it to the skies. In 1808, two Frenchmen, Monsieur de Grandpre and Monsieur Pique, found themselves rivals for the affections of a popular opera dancer, Mademoiselle Tirevite. Instead of settling things on solid ground, they arranged what might be the most ridiculously theatrical duel in history. They each ascended in a separate hot air balloon over Paris, armed with muskets. The goal was to shoot not each other, but the other man's balloon. Imagine the scene. Thousands of Parisians watching as two men floated serenely above them, trying to reload clumsy, single-shot muskets in wobbly baskets while simultaneously aiming at a massive moving target. Pique managed to score a hit, puncturing Grandpre's balloon, which then plummeted to the ground, killing its occupant. It was an extraordinary spectacle of ego and engineering, proving that sometimes love really is in the air, along with lethal projectiles. 10. We've all sat through a boring presentation, but has one ever made you want to commit violence? For a 17th century French officer, the Chevalier de Guise, the answer was a resounding yes. After attending a church service, the Chevalier was so profoundly underwhelmed by the sermon delivered by the Abbé de Gondi that he felt a duel was the only appropriate response. His official justification was that the sermon was so mind-numbingly dull, it constituted a personal insult, not just to him, but to God and all of mankind. This is beyond a bad review. This is theological heckling with a lethal threat. He essentially told a priest his preaching was so terrible that it offended the very concept of divinity and that he must now answer for it with his life. It's the single most aggressive piece of audience feedback ever recorded. 11. Nathan Bedford Forrest, a notoriously fierce American Civil War general, was not a man you wanted to laugh at. Lieutenant Andrew Wills Gould learned this lesson in the deadliest way possible. During a gathering, Forrest was telling a story when Gould let out a laugh that was apparently too loud, too long, or just struck the general the wrong way. Forrest perceived it not as amusement, but as mockery, a direct challenge to his authority and his storytelling skills. He immediately confronted Gould, and the altercation escalated to a full-blown duel. In the ensuing fight, Forrest, an experienced and ruthless combatant, killed the lieutenant. It's a chilling reminder that in some company, the line between finding something funny and getting shot for it is terrifyingly thin. It forever poses the question, was the joke really that bad? Or was the laugh just that annoying? 12. The Prussian military was famous for its discipline, order, and an obsession with rules that bordered on the psychotic. Nothing illustrates this better than the fate of a certain Prussian baron who made a fatal wardrobe error. After a military function, he accidentally picked up and wore another officer's cap. It was an honest mistake, the kind of mix-up that happens all the time. However, in the hypersensitive world of Prussian military honor, this was not a simple mistake. It was seen as an unforgivable breach of protocol, a deep personal insult to the hat's rightful owner. The offense was so severe that a duel was demanded. The Baron, for the minor crime of grabbing the wrong headwear, was killed. He lost his life over a case of mistaken identity for a hat. 13. Insults in high society can be subtle, sharp, and, in this case, deadly. The duel between Lady Almeria Braddock and Mrs Elphinstone in 1792 was sparked by a masterclass in backhanded compliments. During a conversation, Mrs Elphinstone remarked that Lady Braddock had been a beautiful woman and that she certainly didn't look her stated age of 30, implying she was much older. This perfectly crafted passive-aggressive attack, questioning both her current beauty and her honesty, was too much for Lady Braddock to bear. A challenge was issued, and the two women met in Hyde Park, first with pistols, and when those failed to resolve the matter, with swords. Lady Braddock managed to wound her rival, defending her honor against the vicious assault of a well-aimed compliment. It was the 18th century equivalent of a brutal online roast, but with more stabbing. 14. Some people will die for their country, their family, or their faith. A couple of Irish gentlemen in London, however, decided to die for their spelling. During a heated intellectual debate, the two men came to a fierce disagreement over the correct spelling of a particular Greek word. As the argument raged, it became clear that this was not a matter that could be solved by consulting a dictionary. No, this was a matter of honor. Their convictions on the placement of a vowel or a consonant were so absolute that they challenged each other to a duel with swords. In the fight that followed, one of them was killed, becoming a martyr for the cause of proper orthography. His opponent won the argument in the most definitive way possible, proving that in the 18th century, the pen might be mightier than the sword, but the sword is the ultimate spell checker. 15. Before he was a world-renowned astronomer who laid the groundwork for modern physics, Tycho Brahe was a hot-headed student who got into a duel over math. While studying in Germany, Brahe got into an argument with his own cousin, Manderup Parsberg, about who was the superior mathematician. This wasn't a friendly rivalry to be settled with a chalk and blackboard. This was a deeply personal intellectual feud. To prove their respective mathematical prowess, they decided to settle it with swords in the dark. During the duel, Parsberg's blade sliced across Brahe's face, permanently cutting off the bridge of his nose. For the rest of his life, the brilliant astronomer had to wear a prosthetic nose made of brass or silver. It was a permanent metallic reminder that arguing with family over who's better at calculus can have very real, very painful consequences. 16. The rivalry between fans can be intense, but two Italian gentlemen took their literary debate to a fatal extreme. They were arguing over who was the greater Italian poet, Ludovico Ariosto or Torquato Tasso. It was the 16th century equivalent of a Marvel versus DC flame war, but with far higher stakes. The disagreement became so passionate, so personal, that it escalated into a duel to the death. One of the men was mortally wounded. As he lay dying, his opponent, perhaps feeling a pang of guilt, asked him why he had been so willing to die for Tasso's honor. With his last breath, the man confessed that he had never actually read a single line of the poet's work. He literally died for a literary opinion he didn't even have, making him the tragic, idiotic poster child for faking it until you, well, don't make it. 17. We all want a little credit for our hard work, but a theater director in Copenhagen took this desire to a whole new level of drama. After the premiere of his new play, he eagerly grabbed a program, only to discover a horrifying omission. His name was nowhere to be found. The press secretary had, in a moment of catastrophic oversight, completely forgotten to include him. For the director, this wasn't just a typo. It was a public execution of his artistic soul, an erasure of his genius. Consumed by theatrical rage, he bypassed the standard strongly worded letter and went straight to a challenge. He demanded a duel with the press secretary to answer for this crime against his ego. It remains the most extreme reaction to being left out of the credits, a reminder that in the world of theater, hell hath no fury like a director scorned. 18. Charles Augustin Sainte-Beuve was one of France's most feared literary critics, whose pen could make or break a writer's career. After he wrote a particularly scathing review of a new book, the author, predictably, was not pleased. The writer, feeling his literary honor had been trampled, challenged the critic to a duel. Sainte-Beuve, being a man of letters and not a man of action, reluctantly accepted. The day of the duel arrived, and so did the rain. As the two men took their positions with pistols, Sainte-Beuve did something utterly absurd. He raised an umbrella to shield himself from the downpour. His opponent was baffled, questioning the honor of a man who would fight a duel while holding a parasol. Sainte-Beuve famously retorted, "I am willing to be killed, but I am not willing to get wet." The duel proceeded, with neither man hitting his target, but Sainte-Beuve's commitment to staying dry became more legendary than the fight itself. 19. Ben Jonson is remembered today as a brilliant playwright, a contemporary of Shakespeare. But in his time, he was also known for having a famously short temper and a willingness to solve creative disputes with extreme prejudice. In 1598, he got into a bitter argument with an actor named Gabriel Spencer. The details of the feud are murky, but it likely involved a disagreement over a play or Spencer's performance. The argument spilled off the stage and onto the dueling grounds of Hoxton Fields. Despite Jonson having a shorter sword and receiving a wound to his arm, he was the superior swordsman. He disarmed and fatally stabbed Spencer. Jonson was arrested and nearly hanged for murder, avoiding execution only by pleading benefit of clergy, a legal loophole for literate men. It was the most brutal form of script notes ever delivered. 20. Backstage drama is a tale as old as theater itself, but it rarely ends with a fatal stabbing over a wig. In 1735, two actors, Charles Macklin and Thomas Hallam, were preparing for a performance at London's Drury Lane Theatre. A fierce argument broke out over a wig that Hallam was supposed to wear for his role. Macklin, known for his fiery temper, felt that Hallam was being difficult or had somehow insulted him during the dispute. The argument escalated backstage until, in a fit of rage, Macklin lunged at Hallam with his walking stick, which was either sharpened or had a metallic point. The stick pierced Hallam's eye and went into his brain, killing him. It was a shocking and grotesque end to a trivial workplace disagreement, proving that for some actors, the role they are most committed to is that of a complete maniac. 21. John Randolph of Roanoke was a famously eccentric and combative American politician with a hair-trigger temper. His dueling career apparently started early, during his student days, over a subject that seems almost comically trivial: the proper pronunciation of a single word. During a debate or conversation, another student pronounced a word differently than Randolph did. For Randolph, this wasn't a simple linguistic difference. It was an intellectual challenge, an implicit suggestion that he, John Randolph, was wrong. His honor thus wounded by a disagreement over phonetics, he challenged the other student to a duel. It was an early sign of the belligerent personality that would define his political career, where he treated political opponents with the same scorn he had for people who mispronounced words and was more than willing to shoot them for it. 22. This might be the single most tragic case of someone dying for refusing to check their mail. In 1838, a U.S. congressman from Maine, Jonathan Cilley, found himself in a political feud with a newspaper editor, James Webb. Webb wrote an article accusing Cilley of corruption. Another congressman, William Graves of Kentucky, acted as a go-between, attempting to deliver a letter from Webb to Cilley. Cilley, wanting nothing to do with Webb, refused to accept the letter. Graves took this refusal as a personal insult to his own honor as a gentleman courier. He challenged Cilley to a duel not over the contents of the letter, but over the simple act of refusing to receive it. Cilley, a man who had never fired a gun in his life, was forced to fight with rifles. On the third shot, he was killed. He lost his life because he essentially told a delivery man, "Return to sender." 23. The duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton is one of the most famous in American history, but its origins are rooted in something surprisingly petty: hearsay and hurt feelings. The final straw came after Hamilton allegedly made disparaging remarks about Burr at a private dinner party, calling him a dangerous man who was not to be trusted. These comments were later published in a newspaper. Burr, upon reading them, demanded a full retraction and an apology for every negative thing Hamilton had ever said or written about him. An impossible demand. Hamilton, trapped by the rigid code of honor, refused to apologize for unpublished comments. The exchange of increasingly hostile letters led them to the dueling grounds in Weehawken, New Jersey, where Burr, the sitting vice president, fatally shot the former Secretary of the Treasury. A political rivalry that shaped a nation ended in bloodshed over reported gossip. 24. Sometimes the dumbest reason for a duel is a previous duel that never happened. A politician named Thomas Reynolds had once challenged Benjamin Brown to a duel, but Brown had managed to avoid the conflict through diplomatic means. Reynolds, however, saw this not as successful de-escalation but as cowardice. He began to publicly slander Brown, calling him a coward at every opportunity and ruining his reputation. Brown, his name now synonymous with chicken-heartedness, felt he had no choice but to answer the insult. He was essentially forced to accept a second duel to prove that he wasn't afraid to fight the first one. This time, the duel actually happened, and Brown was shot in the leg. He had to get wounded in a gunfight just to prove to everyone that he wasn't the type of person who would try to avoid getting wounded in a gunfight. The logic is dizzying. 25. Political disagreements in the modern era usually end with angry tweets. In the early 19th century, they ended with pistols at dawn. Two of Britain's most senior cabinet ministers, Lord Castlereagh, the Secretary of War, and George Canning, the Foreign Secretary, absolutely despised each other. Their rivalry was a toxic cocktail of personal animosity and professional jealousy, constantly bubbling under the surface of government affairs. The final straw came when Canning secretly plotted to have Castlereagh removed from his post. When Castlereagh found out about the backstabbing, he didn't resign or leak the story to the press. He challenged the Foreign Secretary to a duel. In September 1809, two of the king's most important ministers met in a field and shot at each other. Canning, who had never fired a pistol before, missed, while Castlereagh's shot struck Canning in the thigh. It was perhaps the most extreme form of a cabinet reshuffle in British history. 26. Most feuds burn out after a few weeks or months. The bitter hatred between two French officers, Pierre Dupont and François Fournier-Sarlevez, lasted for 19 years and resulted in over 30 duels. Their epic rivalry began in 1794 when Fournier, a hot-headed hussar, delivered a message to Dupont and felt he was treated disrespectfully. This minor slight sparked a decades-long vendetta. They fought on horseback with sabers, on foot with swords, and with pistols. They fought so often it became a routine, a gruesome hobby they couldn't quit. They would wound each other, recover, and then schedule the next fight. Their personal war only ended in 1813 when Dupont, realizing they were both getting too old for this, tricked Fournier into a pistol duel where both men had to reach into a bag and grab a gun, unaware that only one was loaded. Fournier drew the unloaded pistol, and Dupont finally had him at his mercy, ending the feud by simply refusing to kill him. 27. The poet Lord Byron was known for his dark, brooding nature, a trait he may have inherited from his great-uncle, William Byron, also known as the Wicked Lord. In 1765, the 5th Baron Byron got into a spectacularly stupid argument with his neighbor and cousin, William Chaworth, at a tavern in London. The topic of their drunken debate was who had more game, as in wild animals for hunting, on their respective estates. This trivial, booze-fueled argument about the quantity of deer and pheasants escalated into a furious personal dispute. They retired to a private room in the tavern and, in the dim candlelight, drew their swords. In the clumsy, stumbling fight that followed, Byron impaled his cousin. Chaworth died from the wound shortly after. It was a senseless death that haunted Byron for the rest of his life, a lethal consequence of two rich men arguing about who had the better-stocked backyard. 28. Nothing says aristocratic problems quite like almost killing someone over a parking spot for your horse-drawn carriage. In the 1770s, two prominent British noblemen, Lord Camden and Lord Townshend, arrived at a theater for a night of entertainment. Unfortunately, their coachman got into a fierce argument over who deserved the prime spot right by the entrance. The shouting match between the servants quickly escalated, and the two lords felt their own family honor was now at stake. One couldn't possibly allow his coachman to be outparked by the others. The dispute became so heated that the two lords, pillars of British society, were on the verge of scheduling a formal duel over the incident. Thankfully, cooler heads eventually prevailed, and the duel was called off, but it's a stunning example of how even the most mundane annoyances, like finding good parking, could become a matter of life and death for the elite. 29. Getting rejected on the dance floor is awkward, but it's rarely a cause for a duel. Unless, of course, you are the brother of the rejected lady in 18th century England. Lord Hervey was attending a grand ball when his sister asked a gentleman, Sir John Astley, for a dance. Sir John, for whatever reason, declined her invitation, apparently stating that she was not to his taste. When Lord Hervey heard of this devastatingly honest and tactless rejection, he was consumed by righteous fury. To him, this wasn't just a simple no, thank you. It was a public declaration that his sister was undesirable, a stain on the Hervey family name. He immediately challenged Sir John to a duel to defend his sister's honor from the grievous insult of being turned down for a waltz. It was a clear message to all bachelors of the era. If you don't want to dance, you'd better come up with a more polite excuse. 30. Boredom can make people do strange things, but two French aristocrats in the 17th century turned their ennui into a bloodbath. Finding themselves with absolutely nothing to do and weary of the monotony of courtly life, they decided the most exciting way to pass the time would be to have a duel. There was no argument, no insult, no rivalry, just pure, unadulterated boredom. To make things even more interesting, they convinced their seconds, the friends who were supposed to be there to ensure a fair fight and de-escalate if possible, to fight each other as well. The result was a pointless six-man brawl. By the time it was over, 3 men were dead, including one of the original duelists, and several others were wounded. They had successfully cured their boredom, but the price was a pile of corpses, all for the sake of having something to do on a Tuesday afternoon. 31. Kondraty Ryleyev, a Russian poet and a leader of the Decembrist revolt, was a man who took social etiquette very, very seriously. At a high society ball, he greeted a fellow officer, Konstantin Shakoysky, who, for reasons unknown, did not acknowledge him. Perhaps Shakoysky didn't hear him, didn't recognize him, or was simply distracted. But Ryleyev's mind immediately jumped to the most sinister conclusion. This was a deliberate, public snub, a calculated act of disrespect. His honor felt so wounded by the perceived non-greeting that he challenged the officer to a duel. It's an extreme case of social anxiety escalating to armed conflict. Imagine being so insecure that you're willing to kill or be killed because someone might not have said hello back to you at a party. The duel took place and both men were wounded, all because of a moment of awkward silence. 32. The Duel of the Four is a uniquely Russian absurdity where the seconds fight each other alongside the main duelists. The famous Russian writer Alexander Griboyedov found himself in the middle of one due to a dispute that wasn't even his. His friend, Count Zavodovsky, was in a rivalry with another officer, Sheremetev, over a celebrated ballerina. Naturally, a duel was called. Griboyedov acted as his friend's second, while a man named Alexander Yakubovich was the second for Sheremetev. First, the main duelists fought, and Zavodovsky killed Sheremetev, but the honor of the seconds was now also entangled. Yakubovich, furious over his friend's death, declared that he would now fight Griboyedov. So the two seconds, who had no personal quarrel, fought their own duel. Yakubovich shot Griboyedov in the hand, leaving him with a permanent injury, all because his friend was arguing with someone else's friend about a dancer. 33. Mikhail Lermontov, one of Russia's greatest poets, was a literary genius with a notoriously cruel and sarcastic wit. He loved to roast his friends, but his favorite target was a fellow officer, Nikolai Martynov. Lermontov relentlessly mocked Martynov, giving him the absurd nickname Mountaineer with a Large Dagger, and constantly making jokes about his theatrical Caucasian-style outfits. For months, Martynov endured the public humiliation, but Lermontov's taunts grew more and more vicious. The final straw came at a party where Lermontov's jokes were so cutting that Martynov finally snapped. He publicly declared he would tolerate the insults no longer and challenged the poet to a duel. Lermontov, still not taking it seriously, accepted. At the dueling ground, he reportedly intended to fire into the air, treating the whole affair as a joke. But Martynov was not joking. He took aim and shot Lermontov straight through the heart, killing him instantly. Russia lost one of its most brilliant literary figures because he was, essentially, a toxic bully who couldn't stop making fun of his friends' clothes. We've laid out 33 cases of fatal stupidity, but history is a bottomless pit of absurdity. We know there's a story we missed. Some duel so monumentally dumb, its absence from this list is an insult to pettiness itself. Your mission: expose our failure. What's the single dumbest duel we were ignorant enough to forget? We're reading every comment to find our biggest oversight. While you're at it, validate our research with a like and subscribe for more historical madness.